Hello and welcome to this video for a elf coat with your circular knitting machine with 22 needles. This video is specially for that machine. When you have a machine that's bigger with 46 or 48 needles, see the description of this video to go to the workshop for that size machine because it's slightly different. This coat is a A-line coat and fits very nice. This coat is really simple to make. It will take you about a weekend and then it's finished. We are going to use our small circular knitting machine with 22 needles and we are going to get the maximum out of it because we are going to use it also as a small flatbed machine. Don't run away because I'm going to show you how simple it is to knit flat. And also how simple it is to knit panels that are going from small to wide. It goes also very quick, and I'm also going to show you how to join everything with nice seams. Also very simple. Don't overthink, just go with the flow. Adjusting is also explained. If you want to make it smaller or maybe bigger, the size is basically a one size fits all, but you can adjust it very simple without calculating. I did the calculating. So I made the video in chapters. You will find them in the description of this video. Please read the description of this video because it contains a lot of useful information. Use the timestamps if you are a regular watcher of my videos because you know a lot already. And for the rest, enjoy. It's step by step. Use the pause button. Just go with the flow. Just start and follow all steps and you will end up with a beautiful coat. So, hey-yo, let's begin. This workshop is for a machine with 22 needles. When you have a machine with 46 or 48 needles, a big machine, see the description of the video for a link to that video workshop because it's slight difference and it saves you half the time assembling. So, for the workshop with the small machines, I'm using yarn needles, I'm using a pair of scissors, and I'm using a tool with a hook, like a crochet hook, and I'm using a crochet hook. Most of the time I like to use 5.5 millimeter. You have to make loops with it, and you can use the 5.5 millimeter or the 6 millimeter. It really does not matter as long as it is a big hook. You don't have to know how to crochet for it. It's a tool we are going to use. And I have been using about 8,700 feet of yarn. The amount depends on the length you are going to make and on the width you are going to make. So this is an about for an average size fairy coat, which is, by the way, a kind of one size fits all. For the rest, you need a lot of scrap yarn because we are going to use that when we are going to knit. It's not a part of your project, so make sure it's in a complete different color and at least 2 different colors. So that's for now the information. This is what you need, and time, of course, but it doesn't take that much of time as you would think. I'm going to explain everything from beginning to the end, all kinds of skills. I'm also learning if you don't know them yet. And if you already know a chapter, see the description of this video for timestamps and you can click on the timestamp of the next chapter if you already know how to knit with scrap yarn and remove it in 1 second and that kind of things. So I say, hey yo, let's go, have a lot of fun and let's continue with the pattern. We start our project with knitting tubes that will form the base of our coat, and it's made of different sizes tubes. It's important to label them, tube A, B, C and D, and to mark them. I will explain how to mark them right after this introduction, because that makes assembling a lot more easy. So it's very simple. I've tried to do my best to explain it as good as possible, step by step. The pattern for the base is knitted in tubes. The tube A, you have to knit it twice, also following the 1 second remove scrap yarn technique for closing, as I will demonstrate later on in the video. Tube A is long 200 rows, and we have to mark it after knitting 30 rows, and we have to mark it after knitting 140 rows. So we have to knit that 2 times. Make a screenshot of this page so you can reach back to that if you don't know it anymore. Tube B, also knitting twice, is the longest tube for now. It's going to be 350 rows, but it goes from elbow into hoodie to elbow. So it's very long because the hoodie takes a lot of rows. For that you have to mark the tubes after 30 rows, after 70 rows, after 150 rows, after 70 rows. Then we have to knit first 2 times tube D, and that needs no marks. It's only 80 rows long, also 2 times. And then we are going to knit tube C, and tube C will form just the length of your coat. It's front panels and back panel together, so you decide on the go while assembling if you need more. Some people like to make a very long skirt part and want to start that just right under the yes, at stomach height or something. And there are people who want to make it longer before starting the skirt. You do that by the most easy way, by adding tube C's, so that's why there's no number. Or, and that's the other part I will explain later in the video, is by making the skirt longer. So there are 2 possibilities to make your cardigan longer. With the tubes it's going to be warmer, and with the panels, the skirt, it's going to be also longer. So it's you decide on the go what you are going to do. But first you have to knit 2 times tube A, 2 times tube B, 2 times tube D, following the next videos, and then I meet you back to assemble them into your base coat. Tube A is basically from elbow to elbow. When you want to knit this for a very long person, the pattern is easily adjustable. I will show everything. The pattern I'm showing you is a kind of one size fits all, but you can easily check if your yarn and tension will match about the same length. Knit a swap, just longer than 10 rows, and then count 10 rows. Somewhere in the middle on the side you will find those V-stitches, and mark the first one, and then count 10 V-stitches. The marked one is the first one, and then you count your 10 stitches. Then you mark the last one, and then you can measure. I'm using centimeters, but it doesn't matter what kind of measurement you use. You find the measurement for 10 rows, and when you multiply it 20 times, you get the measurement for 200 rows. And that length should be from elbow to elbow, but since the machine knits with the same needles, it will probably always be the same length, so measurement is not necessary. When you want to make it really smaller or bigger, you can simply adjust the pattern by increasing or decreasing rows. When you want to have a bigger size, you add 10 rows on the back and 10 rows on the front of your project. I did the math, so don't get confused. The 140 rows are the back of your project, and we have to add or leave 10 rows on the 140 part. So you just change the number into 130 to make it smaller and 150 to make it bigger. So you knit 10 rows or you knit 10 rows less. Write this new number on your pattern when you want to adjust. Then we go to tube B. You have to knit 10 rows less or more between the 30 row marks. So say in the middle of the 150 part, you knit 10 rows less or more. And in the C tube, you have to knit 10 rows in the 140 part, and on the 50 row parts you have to increase or decrease 5 rows on both sides, because those are the front panels. It may look complex, but it's not when you follow the workshop step by step. So for this method, increase or decrease 10 rows on the back of tube A, 10 rows on the back of tube B, and of course in the middle of all tube C's, 10 rows and 5 rows on the left and right front panels. So that's how you can increase and decrease. This is the base of our code, and when we have joined them into a small code, we can start adding length. And we add length on tube C, whether it's the skirt part or whether it's more length for the body part. You fit it when you make it, so I have fitted mine and I knitted another tube C because I want to add more length to my body before I start assembling the skirt to my coat. So the lowest part of tube C will be the part where you start adding the skirt. The most simple way to add a size is adding another border at the end of the project, and then you don't have to calculate anything. So when the basic tube A is okay from elbow to elbow, but on the front you need some more fabric, just add an extra border at the end and you will have another extra size on the front. So that's not a problem, it's very simple. Adding an extra border gives a lot of size extra on the front panels. So sizing up or down by knitting more or less rows. Make another screenshot of this chart and remember that you can easily check if the row count will fit from about elbow to elbow. But you can also make sleeves longer on a simple way. But this is basically the start pattern, and adding sleeves you can make them as long as you like to make it fit at the end. So it's a fantastic pattern. You make it your size on the go. It's very simple. So let's continue the complete workshop. And when there are subjects you already know, just use the timestamp. I'm going to demonstrate you how to knit and mark the tubes. And we have to knit 2 tubes A long 200 rows with markings after 30 and 140 rows. 2 times tube B with marks after 30, 50, 20, 150, 20 and 50 rows with a total of 350. Then you knit 2 times tube D with 80 rows no marks, and then you knit tubes C as much as you like, and one you mark after 50, 140 and 50 rows that make 240 rows. We have to mark our tubes for assembling, so I'm going to demonstrate to you how you can mark your tubes when you're knitting them at certain points. It's very simple. You only need some pieces of scrap yarn. So I'm knitting my tube and I have to mark it on row 150. So I'm at row 148 now, but my counter stops. But when I continue, it will pick up again. And I'm going to mark my first stitch of the row number 150. And for that I take a little piece of scrap yarn. I put it under the hook of the first needle of row 150, and then I continue knitting and the needle grabs both yarns, and I knit until I'm almost done with my row 150, and I reset my counter and I'm starting to knit my first row. And now I have to watch carefully that both loops are around those two teeth, and then I'm knitting my first row and continue knitting my tube until I have reached the end or until I need to add another marker. This is an easy way to mark your rows for assembling, and when done you can easily remove them after finishing your project. You have to knit these tubes with the use of scrap yarn. I'm going to demonstrate to you how you can add the scrap yarn and how you can remove it very quick. First I'm going to start to knit with my scrap yarn a couple of rows. And then I'm going to change to another color of scrap yarn. I'm just cutting my yarn, putting it to the inside between the last and the first needle. And then I take another piece of scrap yarn and put it into my feeder, also between the last and the first needle. Make sure that the tails are long enough to reach the table. And knit one round, so every single needle has to pick the color once. I'm cutting my yarn and putting my tail between the last and the first needle, as every tail I have used. And then I'm taking my working yarn. I'm hanging a long piece of thread inside my machine because I'm going to use it to pick up my stitches and do whatever I want to do with them. I'm going to demonstrate to you how I like to close my tube. But first you have to put your yarn between the last and the first needle, and then you are going to knit. So what have we done? We have started with scrap yarn, changed to another color and knit one round with scrap yarn. And now I'm just knitting my desired pattern. That's not interesting because that's for a special project. And now I'm finished. I'm cutting my yarn a long piece because I want to use it to close my tube. I'm taking it out of the feeder between the last and the first needle again. And then I'm going to put my scrap yarn into my feeder between the last and the first needle, and I'm going to knit one round. See, just the same place all the time between the last and the first needle. One round, so every needle just picks the yellow color in this case one time. I'm taking it out of the feeder and I'm taking another piece of scrap yarn. And I'm going to knit a couple of rounds with the scrap yarn. And after knitting a couple of rounds, there are no rules. I'm just cutting my yarn and knitting until my work drops from the machine. So I'm continue cranking when my yarn runs out until my project comes loose. Now I'm going to demonstrate how I'm going to close the tube. I'm going to close the tubes with the use of my 5.5mm crochet hook. It's 5.5mm. You can search for your size in your country. Tubes have two ends, the casting on and the casting off end, and we are going to start with the casting off end. I'm turning the inside to the outside and I'm going to show you the last knitted stitches with my working yarn that are captured between the scrap yarn. And when you put all those ends to the right, you will find your working yarn and you will find those two yarn tails of that single strand row. So those three ends we need. You see that the working yarn is in the middle and the yarn end closest to you goes into the first stitch we need to close the first pair. So I stick my needle through that last stitch and to the first stitch. Look, the working yarn is in the middle and those two yarn tails are coming out of those two stitches, and when you look at the rest of the stitches you will see that you can line them up easily into pairs. I'm putting my needles into all the pairs so you can see how it looks like. And this way you can see if you're doing it correct, because a tube with 22 stitches has 11 pair stitches. So I have to check if I have 11 pair. If not, I made a mistake with picking up those first pair. Those first two stitches. Now I'm putting my needle into my last pair. Those are next to each other but also in front of each other. And now I have 11 pairs and I'm ready to close the pairs. So I'm sticking my crochet hook into that first two loops and I'm taking my working yarn, and with the hook I'm going to pull the yarn through the two loops, and now I've started closing my tube. I'm going to pick up the next pair, pulling the yarn through all three loops on my hook. From now on I have 3 loops on my hook every time I'm going to close a pair. And I'm going to close all 11 pairs. And my last stitch, you always end with a pair. And then I'm pulling my yarn another time through that single loop and the tube is closed. You have the scrap yarn tails on the right. I'm turning so that my working yarn is on the right, and now I'm going to pull out that single row with scrap yarn. That easy, and you can lift off the rest, and now this side of your tube, the end is closed. And now we have to close the beginning of the tube, and that first stitch is a little bit more difficult to find. The hidden stitch is easy to find, but most people make the mistake by not searching for it, so they look at the loops and they think that this stitch is the first stitch and this is the opposite stitch, but it's not. You have to look at where your scrap yarn goes through. Find the first two loops where the yarn ends of the scrap yarn go through. And then you will find that the piece closest to you, that stitch, is a little bit hidden. This is the first stitch and the opposite stitch, and the working yarn is in between. And when you're not sure, you are going to count your 11 pairs again. Line them up. And my last pair, you always end with a pair. And then you continue closing as we did at the end of the tube, exactly the same way. When you are getting used to this, you don't need all those needles anymore. They are just for learning purpose. And sometimes I make also a mistake and I don't end up with a pair. And when I don't end up with a pair, I made a mistake. So I have to undo the closing by just pulling out those stitches and start over again with finding the real first pair. When you have knitted your tubes, we are going to join all tubes C into one panel. I'm going to demonstrate how. We are going to join the two tubes A into one piece, and we are going to join two tubes B in one piece. We don't join tubes D, and I'm going to demonstrate how to do it. How are we going to join them? At the edge of your tube, you will find a straight line of V-stitches. Look, when you hold it up like this, there are all those V-stitches in just one straight line. We are going to use those stitches, but we are going to put our needle in the stitch, and when you put it under those V's in the middle, you will find those bars under the V-stitches. I call them the vertical bars. And those bars we are going to use on both tubes. Look, like this. You just follow that straight line of V-stitches when joining, and you put your needle through the holes between the vertical bars. It's very simple. Stick your needle with the yarn into the first V-stitch of one of the tubes under the first vertical bar and pull through your yarn. Then go to the opposite side, the opposite tube, and find your first vertical bar. Pull through the yarn. Don't pull through all the way. Leave a long tail and go into the first tube, there where you came out, the same hole, the same spot, and pick up two vertical bars and do the same. Go in where you came out in the opposite tube, go under two bars and come out. Don't pull at your yarn, and this is what you are going to continue all the way to the end. Go in where you came out, pick up two vertical bars and just join those tubes like this. When you're at the end or a bit earlier, you can just pull your yarn to close the tubes seamless, but don't do that too soon, because then you cannot recognize your stitches that easy anymore. When you do this correct, pulling at the yarn is magic. Your tubes will be joined seamless on both sides. When you joined the same tubes in bigger pieces, your work will look like this, and then we are ready to continue joining part A to part B. And of course, I will demonstrate to you how easy it is to do that with the use of the marks. We start assembling with our tubes A and B to each other. There are different numbers and you have marked your tubes, so we are going to use those marks. You can find them on the edges of your tubes. Tube A is short and tube B is long, but we are going to start at the same side and we join them to the middle of tube A. But I'm going to fold this paper so you can see what we really are going to do, because we are going to join it partly on both sides, and then the rest of tube B is going to be the hoodie. This paper example is not the best example, but I'm going to demonstrate it to you with the real tubes. And we start with just lining them up together on the right, and we are going to join to the middle of the short tube 30 and 70 rows, and then we start at the opposite end with a new piece of yarn and we join that end also, and then it's so easy that explaining is difficult. So let's start. So basically I'm going to join both tubes for 100 rows from the right to the left or from the left to the right. How are we going to join them? At the edge of your tube you will find a straight line of V-stitches. Look, when you hold it up like this, there are all those V-stitches in just one straight line. We are going to use those stitches, but we are going to put our needle in the stitch, and when you put it under those V's in the middle, you will find those bars under the V-stitches. I call them the vertical bars. And those bars we are going to use on both tubes. Look, like this. You just follow that straight line of V-stitches when joining, and you put your needle through the holes between the vertical bars. It's very simple. Stick your needle with the yarn into the first V-stitch of one of the tubes under the first vertical bar and pull through your yarn. Then go to the opposite side, the opposite tube, and find your first vertical bar. Pull through the yarn. Don't pull through all the way. Leave a long tail and go into the first tube, there where you came out, the same hole, the same spot, and pick up 2 vertical bars and do the same. Go in where you came out in the opposite tube, go under 2 bars and come out. Don't pull at your yarn, and this is what you are going to continue until you find the mark that marks the middle of tube A. It's going to be your 100 point mark or mark number 3, because I've marked row 30 in this pattern and row 50 and 20. Make sure your yarn is longer than the longest panel, and best leave it onto your ball. And I see you back when you are at mark number 100 or the 3rd mark. And then we continue doing it from the opposite side. You start at both ends and you join them also to those 3rd mark, and that will be on the same spot where you finish your first joining. And then There is our hoodie and we have to close that. So I will continue closing the tube. I pull at my yarn and it will close as if it is knitted in just one straight line. You finish off the ends after completing the cardigan. So continue following the marks to the middle, do it from the other side, leave all the tails, and then we continue closing the hoodie. I'm almost finished with assembling both tubes and I'm doing my last pairs of stitches so that both sides will join and form the back of our hoodie. It doesn't matter if you go one stitch further or less, as long as you make sure that you continue closing until you have closed it totally. Pull the yarn, make sure it's in the right tension, and then continue closing the hoodie. I'm going to put my yarn under the last two bars of the previous one. So I'm doing those cross points double. So I'm going through the same stitch, making sure not going through the yarn. And then I'm going to continue closing the hoodie with the same piece of yarn that I have in my hand. So making sure everything is in right tension. Take a moment to arrange everything. Yarn tails that doesn't belong to your currently working yarn, put it to the inside so it won't bother you. And then you continue closing the hoodie all the way to the top. It's very simple, just join bars versus bars. I'm going through the same holes I went through again to make sure that everything is very firm connected here. Look, here I went through already and I go through with my current yarn another time. I do that also at the opposite side. And then I start joining the bars to each other by picking up them 2 by 2 all the way up. Go as far as possible. Find your last bars and then just pull at your yarn and your tubes will be joined very nice. And then we're ready for the next step. I'm making sure that everything is in the correct position and then we continue. This is how all your different parts should look like now. And now we are going to join the AB panel to the D tubes. So let's continue. We are going to join the D tubes to the B tube. So the A tube is on top, the B tube is in between and has the hoodie. Joining is very simple. You start at the edge and you join until it's finished, and you will finish about where this marker is positioned. On the other side you do exactly the same. You are going to join and you will finish about at the point where the stitch marker is. That's very simple. And when you have done that, your work will look like this. The edges will be uneven a bit, but that's not a problem. That will disappear later in the project. Now we are going to fold our work by taking it by the shoulders, picking it up and laying it flat down. And then you have your back and front sleeves looking to you. And we are going to join the sleeves. The sleeves are going to be joined only 30 bars, 30 rows. So that's to the first marker that we made at this point about. So we only have to close this part. It's just a short sleeve because it's the upper sleeve and the lower sleeve comes later. Here is my marker. Till this point I have to join them as we joined everything, and then we leave our yarn hanging. You do the same with the second sleeve. 30 rows starting at the edge, and the front panels stay open. That's important, that you don't think it's a problem. So I have closed my sleeves, short sleeves, and they are closed seamless, very nice. Of course, on the other side also, and you have your front panels hanging open and you have your back part. From your back part are 140 rows unworked. So we have that left for the rest. And we take our C panel. We are going to join that. When you look at the numbers, you will also see 140 rows and 50 rows on the side of the 140 rows. That's your front panel. And on the other side also 50 rows, it's your front panel. So 140 is the back and you fold it like this. And then you are going to join the panels all the way around, front, back and back to front. You don't have to count when joining. You join them bar by bar and you just follow the panel. It will fit, and if it doesn't fit you can smuggle a few stitches. Nobody will know. So join this to each other, the way you joined all the tubes to each other. Use a long piece of yarn because it has to fit all the way around. You can also leave the yarn without cutting, so you know you always have enough. And start joining the panels the way you join them all the time. Pick up the first 2 bars at the corner and connect 2 bars at a time to 2 bars from the other panel all the way around till the end. And when you don't come out, you can see it about 10 bars before the end, you can smuggle a bit. Nobody will notice, really. Nobody will notice. Try to end up as even as possible. Two bars at a time, just follow the tracks all the way around. It will fit perfect or almost perfect. When you are done with the front panel, just turn your work so you're facing the back and then join the back panels. And when you're done with joining the back, you just turn your work and join the last front panel. like this. And when you're done with that, your coat looks like this. And now it's time to start with the skirt part. I'm going to demonstrate to you how you have to knit all the parts and how to assemble them into one piece of fabric. So let's start. Knitting and assembling the panels is easier than you think. We are going to knit panels that are small to wide, and we do that by increasing on the small machine. We have to start small, otherwise we cannot make it wide. Then all the parts are joined into one panel. We are going to use all the V-stitches to join the big panel to the tube, that's the lowest tube of your coat, by joining them to the vertical bars. And therefore we have to knit all those 20 pieces with 9 stitches. So I divided 240 rows into 3. Multiple 2 makes that I need to knit 160 complete V-stitches to increase the panels into wider ones. So 160 stitches, 20 panels, 160 divided by 20 makes 8 stitches wide panels, and we need to add 1 stitch, makes 9 stitches wide casting on the panels. And then I'm going to increase every 10th and 1st row until I have 19 stitches left. But I am going to demonstrate also how to join those panels. It's very simple. I will demonstrate, and the rolled sides will disappear and your panel is going to be completely flat. Let's start this adventure and go to the next step. To knit a panel like this, I need 3 pieces of yarn, my working yarn, and 2 different colors of scrap yarn. And I'm going to cast on with my first piece of scrap yarn, making sure the tail touches the table. And I hook it just under a hook. It doesn't matter what hook. My first hook is on the other side. It doesn't matter. And you do not put it onto panel mode. You keep it in circular. And I'm going to knit or to cast on 9 stitches for this example. This is my 9th stitch. I'm going to put the yarn into my feeder, making sure that the yarn is under the bump between the 9th and the 10th needle, under that bump. And then I put it into my yarn feeder. I'm going to check that the yarn is under all those bumps. As you can see, this stitch isn't, so I'm just sliding it under the bump and make sure it's under the bump after the last stitch. And then I'm going to crank the opposite way, and you have to look at what's happening here. The yarn is under the needle and has to slide off that bump when you crank further, and the moment it slides off you have to give a little tug. It slides off and now I give a little tug. You see that loop is big, and I'm going to show you. Look at the loop around the needle. It's big. I give a tug and it will be smaller, and that will give a nice edge. This is what we are going to repeat constantly. We continue cranking, and when the first needle rises, make sure that the tail is around the 2 little teeth. You see those little teeth? Make sure it's around, and then the needle has to grab the yarn And when the yarn slides under, you have to knit further. When the yarn slides under this bump, you have to stop cranking, so you can hear it even happening. When the yarn slides under the bump between the first and the empty needle, when it slides under, you stop and crank in the other direction. When the yarn slides under the bump, that moment you give a tug. So it's slided under. Look at the loop. I'm going to give a little tug and it will close. And that will give a nice edge. Continue cranking. Make sure that all the loops are around the teeth. This is my last stitch. It has to slide under the bump. I stop and return to the opposite direction. Look at the yarn sliding off the bump. And then I am going to give a little tug. And continue knitting in the opposite direction. And this is basically how flat panel knitting works. In the beginning you have to help. Make always sure that the stitches are in the correct place. It slides off, I stop and crank in the opposite direction. It slides off, I stop, opposite direction, give a little tug. And after a couple of rows, I'm done with this color of scrap yarn. I'm cutting my yarn long enough that it touches the table. I reuse my yarn often. And I'm putting the tail to the inside between the last and the first needle. So I'm cranking further, making sure that the first needle is completely down into the machine. And then I'm going to remove the yarn out of my feeder. And making sure that the first needle rises and the yarn is around the needle. The loop is around the needle. So you see those empty hooks next to it. I take my second color of scrap yarn. I put it in the machine long enough that it touches the table between the empty needle and the first needle. And then I'm going to knit all 9 stitches once. I'm cranking till the last needle sinks completely. And then I crank back a little that the scrap yarn is released from the other needles. And I'm cutting it. And now I'm ready to start with my panel. See? The yarn is under the needle. That's important. I'm going to crank circular further until my first needle rises. And now I'm going to start with my working yarn. And I'm going to add it between the empty and the first needle. I'm making sure that my yarn tail is long enough that I can use it to finish off my panel later. You will find out how much you need. An arm length will do, and then you put your yarn into your feeder between the empty needle and the first needle, always in the same spot. And then we are going to knit 1 row. This is our first row. We are going to count our rows. So this is my first row. I knit until the yarn slides under the bump, and then I knit my second row and my third row and my fourth. I'm going to increase every 10th row and every first row except our very first and very last row. So this is row 8. I'm going to knit 10 rows and then increase and start to count over. This is row 10. Normally I would stop at this point when the yarn slides under, but now I'm going to increase 1 stitch, so the yarn has to slide under that second bump. So you have to crank a little bit further until the yarn slides under. And that's how you increase. You stop and then you start cranking in the opposite direction the first row and make sure that everything is in place. And then knit your first row and increase after the last stitch also another stitch. So you crank 1 bump further and then you start knitting the second row and you have increased another stitch. So now you have 2 more stitches and you crank until you have knitted another 10 rows. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And we have to increase 1 stitch. 1. We have to increase 1 stitch. 2, 3. We have 2 more stitches. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Increase 1 stitch. 1. Increase 1 stitch. 2. You have 2 more stitches now. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Increase 1 stitch. Row 1. Increase 1 stitch. 2. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Increase 1 stitch. Row 1. Increase 1 stitch. And now you will see that you have left 3 empty needles. So this is the last increase we can do, because you always have to leave 3 needles empty. So now you have 19 stitches. Row 2. You see that this stitch stays under the hook. Row 3. Row 4. Row 5. 6. 7. 8. 9. and 10. And our panel is finished. We are going to cut our yarn about an arm length or a bit more. And we are going to take it out of the feeder and put it to the inside. And then we are going to change to our scrap yarn again. Make sure that the first needle with the stitches is in front of the feeder. And then take one strand of scrap yarn and knit one row. Make sure the tail is long enough that it touches the table and that it's between the empty and the first needle. And then you are going to knit all the stitches. All 19 in this example. When you're at the end, cut your yarn long enough that it touches the table. This is my last stitch. I take my yarn out of the feeder and I crank a little bit further until that needle sinks completely. Put also that tail to the inside and then grab your next color of scrap yarn and put it also to the inside. You can choose where you put it. It can be put everywhere between the beginning and the end. It doesn't really matter where you do it. You can also do it between the last and the first needle. Make sure that everything is in place and start cranking circular. I just missed this stitch, but that does not matter because my first stitch is knitted with the scrap yarn. And then you are going to knit just circular a couple of rows. And you will drop the stitches where there is no work, but that's not a problem. It will secure all stitches. So I'm knitting about 5 rows. When you're not used to this method, you knit a few rows more. And then you cut your yarn and you crank until your work drops from the machine. One stitch stays and it's loose. And then your panel is knitted. And we have to cast it off nice so it's ready for assembling. I start casting off at the small side, the beginning. When you turn the ribs towards you, you will find the piece of yarn on your right, and then you can see that your working yarn is secured between the scrap yarn. And we know that we have started with 9 stitches, but when you are going to count, you will find probably only 8 because the 9th stitch is a bit hidden at the end. So counting will make sure that you will have all 9 stitches. This is my working yarn. I pick up the first loop with my hook and I pull through the yarn tail and I pick up the second stitch and I pull through the yarn tail through both loops. Do this not too tight. Through both loops. Pick up all those 9 stitches and pull the yarn through all the loops on your hook. And don't miss the last stitch, the 9th stitch in this example. You can find it because the scrap yarn goes through that stitch. The one single strand of scrap yarn goes through that stitch. This is the most difficult stitch to find when closing. And when you have it, just pull through the scrap yarn and then pull through the yarn for another time through the loop. And then we are going to pull out that single strand of yarn. You can just pull it. Be careful. And then you can take off the rest of the scrap yarn and this end is secured and ready for assembling. And then we have the opposite side with the circular knitted scrap yarn. It's the end of our project and it's a lot easier to find all the stitches. Roll it like this so you can see the rib side and start at the point where your working yarn ends, and then you have to find the first stitch. Your scrap yarn end goes through the first stitch. When you pull at your working yarn, the stitch will be tighter. So that's the first stitch. Stick in your crochet hook, grab your working yarn and grab it with the hook and pull it through that one loop on your hook. The rest of the stitches, stick in your needle, grab the yarn and pull through both loops on your hook. Don't do it too tight. Go into the next stitch, pull through both loops. I have 19 stitches in total, and I'm going to do this for all 19 stitches. You can see the stitches are in between the scrap yarn and just next to each other, so it's very simple to pick them up and close them like this. Always count your stitches so you won't miss a stitch. And my last stitch, you can see it very easy on the end of your project. And when I'm done, I'm going to pull the yarn through another time and pull it through all the way. And now it's finished, and I'm going to remove that one single strand of scrap yarn by just pulling it out. And then I can take off the rest, and my panel is closed and secured and ready for assembling. I'm making a lot more for my current project, but this is how it looks. It will always roll to the inside, but when you assemble it, it is going to work out fine. So I continue knitting and see you back when I'm going to assemble them. Joining these panels is not difficult. You will get a nice flat seam on the outside and a neat seam on the inside. And the most beautiful part of the joining is that your work will stop rolling where it's joined. First I'm going to explain it on paper and then I will demonstrate it to you. We are going to join them by the vertical bars that you will find under the V-stitches next to the edge. When you look at the edge, that's basically nothing. Next to the edge you will find a line with V-stitches, and when you poke your needle under the V's, you will see the vertical bars, and we are going to use them, not the side stitches, but the vertical bars, to join the panels to each other. So you start at the smallest side, don't use the edge, but use the straight line with real V-stitches and find the vertical bars. The stitches are just in a straight line. Make sure you use those stitches, not those side stitches. And we are going to join the panels with those bars, 1 by 1, 2 by 2 by 2, until you reach the increase, and then we are going to hop over. We are going to hop over to the next created line with V-stitches. So you're knitting flat, hop over, knitting flat, hop over at every increase. I'm going to use a yarn tail that's long enough, or another piece of yarn. I'm putting it into my yarn needle. And then I'm going to join the panels. I'm joining them with the stockinette side facing towards me. I'm using the tail of this one, so I'm starting at the other one. I'm rolling the edge to the outside, and then I find the line with V-stitches next to the edge, and I'm poking my yarn needle under the first V-bar. We are going to join them 1 by 1 to start, and then 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 until we reach our increase. You have to get a little bit handy. I'm holding my index finger in between them. You don't pull at the yarn. I'm finding the first bar at the opposite side. And then I just go in where I went out at the other one. Join 2 bars and go to the opposite. Poke in where you came out. Join 2 bars. Poke in where you came out. Join 2 bars. Don't pull at your yarn. You are going to pull them together when you're finished or later on. So, and you have to keep in mind that every other pair of stitches you will find an increase. So you have to look at the edge. Sometimes when you increase, it gets wider. Look, here is an increase, and then you see that these are the V-stitches we are following. There is another line with V-stitches, and that's what we are going to do. We are poking in where we came out, and instead of coming out in the same line, you are going to hop over to the V-stitch that is new by the increasement. So this was the old one and this is the new one. And then you continue. On the other side you will find an increasement also, probably, or maybe later. Instead of the same bars, you hop over to the increasement and continue from there. See? You just go to the next one, to the side. And then we have a couple of stitches just in that same line until the next increase comes by. So it's basically the same as joining tubes. And this is what it is. Just follow the lines, follow the train track. And when you come at an increase, you just hop over to the next track. And when ready, you just pull at the yarn. And when you have done it correctly, you can pull it and it's closed. And so you are going to join all your panels till you have one big piece of fabric, and don't cut the yarn tails. We are going to need them for finishing off. Now you have 2 pieces and we need to join them. So we are going to join the skirt to the coat. It will fit perfect. We are going to join the skirt to the bottom of the coat. This is not difficult, and I will demonstrate how this works. First I will explain and then I will demonstrate. We are going to join it like this. You start at the corner and you are going to pick up V-stitches. Always those V-stitches. You have to find your first V-stitch from the corner, and this is just a corner and half stitch. This is a complete V-stitch, and you will find them all next to each other. There are rows and you can find the top stitch just under the edge. The last stitch is a half V, and the first half V of the next panel together will be a complete V-stitch. I will demonstrate it later. So you continue picking up V-stitches, and when you switch from panel to panel, you pick up half V-stitches from each panel, the last half stitch, and so you get stitches that are from 2 panels. You go all the way around, joining them to the vertical bars of the tube on the bottom of your coat. and we pick up those vertical bars just in one line all the way around. We are going to join all V-stitches one at a time. We are going to join the first V-stitch to one vertical bar and the second to two vertical bars, and we repeat 1 2 1 2 all the way around. First you have to find your first complete V-stitch. It is best to find the top V-stitch, but it doesn't really matter very much if you take a row lower. Sometimes you have to hop when the panels are not even, but try to get the highest V-stitch, because then you get the smallest ridge on the inside. But when you find it difficult, you just take the second stitch. It doesn't really matter. Always pick up one V-stitch. First V-stitch to one bar. One bar. First V-stitch, one bar. Take a real long piece of yarn. Make sure it doesn't get tangled. And then find yourself your second V-stitch and join that to two bars. You go in where you came out, stick under two bars, and then pull through the yarn. Don't pull it tight, you do that later. And then I pick up one V-stitch, I call it my first one again, and connect that to one vertical bar, going in where I came out. And then my second V-stitch to two bars. And that I continue until I get at the end of this panel. Try to untangle your yarn, otherwise you cannot pull it close later. And continue doing this, all those V-stitches in a row. And when you enter a new panel, you continue picking up V-stitches by picking up half V-stitch of one panel and half V-stitch of the next panel. And then continue doing exactly the same as you did all the time. And when you enter the next panel, just join them half and half. And when your yarn gets a little bit short, you just pull at your yarn as you did all the time. This is also mattress stitch. Last V-stitch of this color panel. And now I have to pick up the half side stitch and the half side stitch of the next panel, and together they form a V-stitch, and so you get your 8 V-stitches. And continue joining all the way around. Keep in mind at the end that you can smuggle. When you pull at the yarn, your work will close so nice. And on the inside you get also a very nice ridge. So continue joining your skirt to your coat, and then when finished we are almost done and going over to the next step. This is what your coat looks like now, and in the next step I will demonstrate how you can calculate the length of the border And when you want to have a big border, knit two same tubes, and I will show you how you can assemble the border seamless to your cardigan. I'm going to demonstrate everything. Knitting the border and making it long enough that it will fit. How do we do that? The border starts at the bottom of your coat and goes all the way up along the front panel, along the hoodie, back along the other front panel, all the way to the bottom. But how do you know how many rows you have to knit? It's very simple. I will explain. First, you start, of course, here or here to knit. The first part that comes along the border is the white knitted panels. Those are both V-stitches, so they have to be the same amount of rows. In my pattern, this part is 60 rows long, so my tube has also to be 60 rows, so I wrote down the number 60. Then we get the vertical rows, the vertical tubes, and for every tube we have to knit on our border 17 rows. So 1, 17, 17, 17, and there we have 17, and this is also 17 rows. And the next row is going into the hoodie, so that does not count for this connection. So I have 5 tubes, maybe you have 6, then you write down 5 times 17. You just have to knit your to draw your own coat. The hoodie is 190 rows. We can discuss it. No, it's just 190 rows. It's a fact. Then you go all the way back down, knitting the same amounts as on this side. So I have to knit 5 times 17 rows and 60 rows for the height of the part where we have to join it like this. So I have made the, I calculated it already for you using this pattern, so you can make your own. So in my pattern I have to do 10 times 17 rows is 170 rows. I have to do 2 times 60 rows is 120 rows, and the hoodie 1 time 190 is 190, and altogether it's 480 rows for the border, or maybe 2 times if you like it very wide. So simple it is to knit the border, and of course you make it just as the rest with the scrap yarn, start and casting off and close it that way. And now I'm going to demonstrate to you how you can join it seamless like this. It's very nice, and also on the inside it's very nice. So let's continue with the next step and knit, knit, knit. The next step is joining the border. I have knitted my very long border, and I'm going to join it from the bottom of the front panel all the way up along the hoodie and all the way down to the bottom again. It's not very complicated. I'm using a very long piece of yarn. I leave it, I don't cut it, so it's always long enough to cover the whole border. The first part of the tube we are going to join to the panel part of my coat. On the tube I'm going to use the vertical bars, and I'm using them all the way around. so vertical bars on the tube. When you look at your panel part, you will see that you have to join bars to bars. So that's very simple. The only thing is that we have to hop at the increasings. So we are going to join bars versus bars like we did all the time. That's not a problem, but since we have increased, we have to hop to another track. On the panel, we are going to use the bars closest to the edge. And when it increases, we do the hop. After joining to the panel, we are going to join 2 tubes. And for that, we have to join V-stitches to vertical bars. So every other V-stitch, we pick up 1 or 2 bars, just like we did before, and continue closing all the way around those tubes like this. And when you're at the last tube, you will find a strange angle, and you just fold your tube along the angle and continue joining bars to bars all the way along the hoodie down until you come to another angle, and then you just fold your tube along the tubes and continue joining V-stitches to bars until you get at the bottom panel, and you continue joining bars to bars. It's very simple. It's nothing different than we did before. And when it doesn't fit exactly, you smuggle a bit. Nobody will know. Then your coat will look like this, and we only have to add the sleeves. The sleeves are simple. You don't really need to calculate because it's very simple, but I will show you how it works. You have a sleeve with 5 tubes. That means you have 5 times 11 V-stitches in the round. And those stitches we are going to join to basically the same amount of V-stitches that we will cover with our panels. I can show you a difficult calculation, but it's too complicated, and it's rather very simple because you have to knit 11 stitches plus 1. So you are going to cast on every panel with 12 stitches, because with the joining you will lose 1 stitch. Then you are going to increase every 10th and 1st row, or every 12th or every 8th row, to get a wide panel, and it will be wide 19 stitches at the end. You can adjust the length, and you knit 10 pieces and join them into short sleeves as we did with the skirt the same. And then we are ready to join the last pieces. We are going to join the short sleeve to the upper sleeve, and that's so simple because we are going to join V-stitches to V-stitches. So we are going to join 1 V-stitch to another V-stitch from the other part. I like to join them upside down to each other, but you can also join them almost seamless by joining V to V. So you start wherever you like to start by picking up 1 V-stitch of 1 piece, and then I like to take the upside down one V-stitch at the other piece. Don't pull hard on your yarn, and then continue picking up the next V-stitch and join it to the V-stitch on the opposite side, and go all the way around like this. I will show you how I do the change over between the two tubes or panels. It's basically the same. To make it as nice as possible. After joining both sleeves, you only have to tuck away all the ends. For that I just knot the yarn tails that are together and put them or between the two layers of the tube or through the rib on the inside of the panels. I'm almost at the change to the next tube and I will pick up half stitch on both sides of both tubes and they will form a complete V. So every half side stitch you join to each other to form a complete V, and then you continue joining the V stitches exactly the same. When finishing off, you will also find a few loose yarn tails. Just secure them and tuck them also in. Look how beautiful this gets. And before you know it, your elf coat is finished. I hope you liked this free workshop. If you want to donate something to keep this channel free available, please give a small donation to my PayPal. See the description of this video. And please give me a thumb up and join my channel if you want to see more of my circular knitting machine workshops. Check the description of this video for a lot of helpful information. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, with love, from Holland. Bye bye.